I personally closed the lid on my only son's casket 20 years ago, yet last month, my landline rang, flashing his name and number on the caller ID. The man on the other end whispered a secret that turned my grief into gasoline. They think I am just a frail old widow, but they are about to learn that a mother's rage can burn down $1 billion empire. I will make them pay for every single lie. My name is Eleanor Briggs, to the rest of the world, and certainly to the residents of the small town of Riverside Hollow. I am just a 72-year-old widow living out her final chapter in a peeling wooden house off the main road. My life has been a quiet, suffocating routine for 2 decades. I drink my tea in the morning. I sit in my rocking chair watching the world move on without me. And once a year, I drive to Greenhaven Rest Cemetery to place flowers on a cold stone slab. That stone bears the name of my son, Michael. He was 22 when he died in a car explosion. The police told me it was a tragic accident, a fuel leak that ignited on the Old Mill Bridge. I believed them because I had no strength left to question the ashes. My home is a mausoleum of memories. Framed photographs of Michael cover the walls, freezing him forever in his youth. His baseball trophy sits on the mantel, collecting dust. But there is one drawer in the hallway cabinet that I never open. It contains the last physical remnants of his life, the items recovered from the scene that were not incinerated. I closed that drawer 20 years ago, terrified that looking inside would destroy whatever sanity I had left. I thought I had severed all ties with the pain of that day. Immediately after the funeral, I called the phone company and demanded they permanently disconnect Michael's landline number. I could not bear the thought of someone else inheriting those digits. Or worse, seeing his number appear on my caller ID ever again. It was supposed to be over. But one evening last month, the past did not just knock on my door, it kicked it down. It was around 7 at night. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the only light coming from the small lamp overhead, sorting through a stack of meaningless junk mail and utility bills. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Then, the phone rang. It was not a cell phone chime, but the jarring, mechanical trill of the old rotary phone on the wall. I stared at it. No one calls me this late. With trembling knees, I pushed my chair back and walked over to the unit. When my eyes focused on the small, backlit display, my breath hitched in my throat. Michael. Home. Below the name was the exact sequence of numbers that had been dead for 20 years. My heart hammered against my ribs, a painful, erratic rhythm. I stood frozen, my hand hovering over the receiver. This is a sick joke, I whispered to the empty room, but the phone kept ringing. It screamed into the silence, demanding to be answered. It felt like a summons from the grave. I grabbed the receiver and pressed it to my ear, my knuckles white. "Hello?" I asked, my voice barely a croak. At first, there was only static. It was a harsh, aggressive crackle, like a storm tearing through a radio signal. "Who is this?" I demanded, anger rising to meet my fear. The static surged, and then a voice cut through the noise. It was hoarse, breathless, and distorted, but it sent a shockwave of recognition through my entire body. It was the voice I had replayed in my dreams for 2 decades. "Mum?" The man on the other end whispered, the word breaking with exhaustion. "Mom, I didn't die like they said. Don't believe them." My blood turned to ice. "Michael." The line went dead with a sharp, final click. I did not hang up. I couldn't. I slid down the wall until I hit the linoleum floor, clutching the receiver to my chest as if it were a lifeline. I sat there, in the semi-darkness, gasping for air, unable to distinguish between reality and madness. Had I finally cracked? Was this the dementia everyone expected of a woman my age after 10 minutes of paralyzing fear? I forced myself to stand. I dialed Argus Tel, the phone service provider. I needed logic. I needed a technical explanation. I need to trace a call I just received. I told the operator, my voice shaking uncontrollably. It came from a number ending in 4599. The operator typed for a moment, the clicking of keys sounding loud in my ear. Ma'am, I am looking at the logs now. That number was permanently cancelled 20 years ago. It is inactive. It is physically impossible for a call to originate from a disconnected line. Our system shows no incoming call to your house in the last hour. I just spoke to him, I shouted, losing my composure. It rang. I picked it up. Maybe you were dreaming, ma'am, the operator said, her tone dismissive. I slammed the phone down. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my living room in the dark, staring at the silent telephone. The voice replayed in my mind on an endless loop. Don't believe them? If the phone company said the number did not exist, and the police said my son was dead, then the world was telling me I was insane. But I knew my son's voice. I stood up, ignoring the ache in my joints. I walked to the hallway and stood before the cabinet. For 20 years, I had been afraid of the ghosts inside. But tonight, fear was replaced by something colder and sharper. I pulled the drawer open. It was time to unseal the box. The cardboard box smelled of dust and cedar, a scent that instantly transported me back to a time when my house was full of noise and life. I sat on the floor, my legs aching, and sifted through the artifacts of a life cut short. There was Michael, at 22, smiling in front of the Heliodyne Dynamics sign, his arm draped over a buddy's shoulder. He looked so proud in his new engineer's uniform, yet there was a shadow in his eyes even then. We had argued incessantly that year. He wanted to move to the city, to Arlington Haven, to escape the suffocating quiet of our small town. I wanted him to stay. I wanted him safe. My memory drifted to that final, terrible night. The kitchen was cold, and the air was thick with unspoken resentment. Michael had been pacing, his hands trembling as he packed a bag. Con, please, just talk to me. I had begged, grabbing his arm. He had pulled away gently but firmly. I have to do the right thing. Mum, you don't understand. It's bigger than just a job. Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. He walked out the door, the screen slamming shut behind him, and drove his battered sedan into the dark. Less than an hour later, the ground shook. The explosion on Old Mill Bridge was loud enough to rattle the windows of my house 3 miles away. By the time I got there, the fire was already dying down. Sheriff Clay Mathers held me back as I screamed. He was a big man, a family friend, and he wrapped his heavy arms around me while the wreckage smoldered. Don't look. Eleanor. He had whispered into my hair. It was a fuel leak. A tragic accident. There's nothing left to see. The casket was closed at the funeral. Clay told me the fire had been too intense, that the body was unrecognizable. I buried a box of ashes and emptiness. Now, sitting on my floor 20 years later, I picked up a folded piece of paper I had never looked at closely before. It was Michael's final phone bill. I ran my finger down the list of calls. My breath caught in my throat. On the night of the accident, At 8:17 in the evening, exactly 40 minutes before the explosion, there was an outgoing call. It lasted 11 minutes. The number dialed was not a friend or a girlfriend. It was the main switchboard for Heliodyne Dynamics. Why would he call his office 40 minutes before dying in a car explosion driven by a sudden, frantic energy? I grabbed the bill and my purse. I drove to the local Argostel branch downtown, ignoring the speed limit. The fluorescent lights inside the store were blinding. I slammed the bill onto the counter in front of a young manager whose name tag read, Kevin. "I need to know about this number," I said. My voice steady, despite the tremors in my hands. It belonged to my son. I was told it was deleted 20 years ago, but last night, I received a call from it. Kevin looked at me with pity, the kind young people reserve for the confused elderly. "Ma'am, numbers get recycled. It was probably a spoof call. Check it," I demanded. "Please." He sighed and typed the sequence into his computer. He clicked his mouse a few times, and then his eyebrows shot up. He leaned closer to the screen. Squinting. "That's weird," he muttered. What I asked sharply. "What is it?" "The number isn't deleted," Kevin said slowly. "It's flagged as frozen. It's an active line, but it's hidden from the public directory. Someone has been paying the maintenance fee on this specific line for 20 years to keep it reserved." The room spun. Who? Who is paying for it? Kevin clicked another tab. It's a corporate account. It's billed to Heliodyne Dynamics. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. My son's employer. The place he was trying to run away from. "Print that out for me," I said. Kevin shook his head, looking nervous. "I can't do that, Ma'am. This account has a high-level privacy tag. I could lose my job for even looking at it." He turned his swivel chair away to answer a landline ringing on the back desk. In that split second, I did not think. I acted. I pulled my smartphone out of my purse, a device I usually only used for emergencies, and snapped a photo of his computer screen. I walked out before he turned back around. Back in my kitchen. I printed the photo and taped it to the wall next to the phone bill. The image was slightly blurry, but the text was legible. Next to the billing status for Michael's number, there was a contract ID code and a project name attached to the expense. Project Lazarus. My son did not die in an accident. A billion-dollar defense contractor had paid to keep his digital ghost alive for 2 decades. And last night, Michael had used that ghost to reach out. I looked at the phone bill, then at the photo on my wall. It felt less like a clue and more like a desperate note passed from a prisoner. "I am listening. Michael." I whispered to the empty room. "I am listening." I marched into the Riverside Hollow Police Department with my purse clutched tight against my ribs. Inside that leather bag were the phone bill and the photograph of the screen from the phone company. The only physical proof I had that the world was lying to me. The station smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. At the front desk, a young woman with a tight ponytail and a badge that read, Lieutenant Zoe Martinez, looked up from her computer. She had kind eyes, but they held that familiar glaze of skepticism I had grown used to seeing whenever I spoke. "I need to reopen the case file on Michael Briggs," I said, placing my documents on the high counter. "He died 20 years ago. It was ruled an accident. It was not an accident." Zoe blinked, picking up the papers. "Ma'am, 20-year-old cases are usually archived deep in storage, unless there is new DNA evidence or a confession. I have a phone call," I interrupted. "From a dead man." And I have proof that Heliodyne Dynamics has been paying for his phone line under a program called Lazarus. At the mention of Heliodyne and Lazarus, Zoe's expression shifted. A small frown creased her forehead. The defense contractor. This file. It would have been Sheriff Mather's case back then. It was. I confirmed. I will see what I can find, she said cautiously. Please, take a seat in the waiting room. I sat in a hard plastic chair for nearly 40 minutes. I was beginning to feel foolish, a senile old woman chasing ghosts, when the heavy door swung open. It was not Zoe. It was Clay Mathers. He was 68 years old now, retired for 5 years. But he still walked with the heavy, claiming stride of a man who owned the town. He wore a crisp flannel shirt and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Eleanor. He boomed, spreading his arms as if to hug me. I happened to be dropping by to say hello to the boys and heard you were here. What is this nonsense about reopening Michael's file? I stood up, refusing to be intimidated. It is not nonsense. Clay. Why is Heliodyne paying for Michael's phone number? What is Project Lazarus? Clay laughed, a low, rumbling sound that felt patronizing. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. Oh, Eleanor. Grief does strange things to the memory. Lazarus. That is just technical jargon, probably a billing code for old employee accounts. I have seen it a dozen times. It means nothing. It means something to me, I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. I want to see the accident photos, the original ones. I need to see the car again. Clay sighed, his face arranging itself into a mask of pity. I wish you could. But we had a pipe burst in the archives about 10 years back. Terrible water damage. A lot of the old physical files from the 90s and early 2000s were ruined. Michael's photos were in that batch. How convenient. I snapped. Clay's eyes narrowed just a fraction, the warmth vanishing for a split second. Go home. Eleanor. Rest. You do not want to dig up a grave only to find it is empty. He ushered me out like a wayward child, but as I walked past the front desk, Zoe Martinez did not look up. However, as I reached the glass doors, my phone buzzed in my purse. I checked it outside. It was a text from an unknown number Old Tracks diner. 7 o'clock. Don't bring Clay. At 7 sharp. I sat in the back booth of the diner, nursing a black coffee. Zoe slid into the seat opposite me, looking over her shoulder. She opened a laptop and turned the screen toward me. Clay is lying, she whispered. The physical files might be wet pulp, but we digitized everything important 15 years ago. He knows that. On the screen, 2 images loaded. My heart seized. The first was the sedan, a twisted skeleton of blackened metal. The second was a wider shot of the bridge, taken from a distance. Look here, Zoe said, pointing to the edge of the frame. In the background, parked on the gravel access road about 50 yards from the burning bridge, was a black SUV. The license plate was washed out by the flash, but on the driver's side door, faint but unmistakable, was the geometric logo of Heliodyne Dynamics. And look at the steering wheel in the first picture. Zoe continued, her voice dropping even lower. The front of the car was obliterated, but the steering column is intact. Eleanor. The airbag did not deploy. I stared at the image. What does that mean? It means he did not crash. Zoe said grimly, airbags trigger on impact. If the car exploded but the airbags stayed in, the car was likely stationary when it blew up. He was stopped on that bridge. and that SUV was watching him. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. They killed him. They waited for him to stop, and they blew him up. Zoe closed the laptop fast as a waitress walked by. "Listen to me, Mrs. Briggs. You are poking a sleeping dragon. I have seen complaints about Heliodyne disappear from the system overnight. They are a steel wall. If you keep pushing, they will push back." I looked at the black screen of the laptop, seeing my own aged reflection. I remembered the static on the line. "Don't believe them. Let them push," I said, picking up my purse. I have nothing left to lose but my time. I tracked down Jonah Price to a rusted mobile home on the outskirts of Falcon Ridge, a desolate stretch of land 2 hours from my house. He was the only name from Michael's past I could remember. The shy boy who used to come over for dinner and praise my meatloaf. When he opened the door, however, the boy was gone. In his place stood a gaunt, terrified man with dark circles carved deep under his eyes. "Go away." "Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling as he tried to shut the thin metal door. "I have nothing to say to you." "I received a call from Michael," I said, jamming my foot in the doorframe. "And I know about Project Lazarus." The colour drained from Jonah's face so fast I thought he might faint. He grabbed my arm, his grip painful, and yanked me inside. He slammed the door, threw 3 deadbolts, and aggressively pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut. The trailer smelled of stale smoke and fear. "You should not have come here," Jonah hissed, pacing the small kitchen. "If you know that name, you are already in danger. Tell me the truth." "Jonah," I demanded. "My son died for this. What is Lazarus?" Jonah stopped pacing. He looked at the floor, wringing his hands. "It was supposed to be a treatment for PTSD. That is what they told us. But it was a slaughterhouse. Eleanor. They were testing neural chips and experimental aggression drugs on veterans. These men, they did not consent. It was torture legalized by a defense contract. They broke their minds to see if they could rebuild them as weapons. I felt bile rise in my throat. "And Michael found the logs," Jonah whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "He was going to the federal board. The night he died. That call on your bill. He called me. He was crying. He said, 'Jonah, if I don't show up tomorrow, send this to my mother.' He told me he was scared." Jonah walked to a loose floorboard near the sink and pried it open. He pulled out a dusty plastic bag containing a silver USB drive wrapped in duct tape and an old, bulky burner phone. He shoved them into my hands. "This is everything," he said, his voice cracking. "The data, the recordings. I was a coward, Eleanor. I was so afraid they would do to me what they did to him. I stayed quiet for 20 years. I looked at the items in my hands, heavy with the weight of 2 decades of silence. "Thank you, Jonah." He pushed me toward the door. "Go. Drive fast. Do not go straight home." I drove away with the setting sun in my rearview mirror. My heart was pounding, a mix of adrenaline and horror. About 30 minutes later, I turned on the local AM radio station to keep myself awake. The news anchor's voice cut through the static. "Breaking news from Falcon Ridge. Police are investigating the suspicious death of a local resident this evening. Jonah Price, 44, was found dead in his home just minutes ago. Authorities say he appeared to have fallen down the front steps and broken his neck." I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the gravel shoulder. The silence inside the car was deafening. Fallen down the steps I had just left him. He was terrified inside a locked trailer. They had been watching. They had seen me leave. And then they had moved in to sanitize the leak. I drove the rest of the way in a blur of tears and terror, checking my mirrors every few seconds. When I finally locked my own front door, I went straight to my computer. My hands shook so badly it took me 3 tries to plug in the USB drive. A folder popped up. Inside was an audio file titled "For Mom." I clicked play. "Mom?" Michael's voice filled the room, sounding so young, so tired. "If you are hearing this, it means they are done with me. Do not let them bury the truth. You deserve to know." I covered my mouth to stifle a sob. It was him? It was really him? Next to the audio file was a scanned document. It was a formal whistleblower complaint detailing the atrocities of Project Lazarus. At the bottom of the page, listed as the program director, was a name that made my blood run cold. Dr. Adrian Cole. I gasped. Adrian had been Michael's mentor. He had come to our house for Christmas. He had told Michael he was like a second father to him. I sat back in my chair, the room spinning. I looked at the old burner phone Jonah had given me, and then at my own landline. A terrible realization settled over me. The call last month, the static, the whispered warning. It wasn't Michael reaching out from the grave. It was Jonah. He must have set up a spoofing program, a dead man's switch on a timer. Or perhaps he made the call himself, using an old recording to wake me up because he knew his time was running out. "They killed you both," I whispered, touching the screen where Adrian Cole's signature sat in black ink. "And they think I am just a grieving old woman." I wiped my eyes. The tears were gone. All that was left was cold, hard iron. I sat at my kitchen table with the burner phone Jonah had given me, scrolling through the call history with trembling fingers. There was only one outgoing call logged in the device. It was dated the exact same night I received that phantom phone call, time-stamped to the very minute my landline had rung. The log showed a spoofing application used to mask the caller ID with Michael's old number. It was not a ghost. It was Jonah. He had staged the call from beyond the grave to shock me out of my 20 years of grieving silence. He knew he was about to die, and he used my son's voice to make sure I would finally listen. "You stubborn fool," I whispered to the device, wiping a tear from my cheek. "You should have just come to me." But I knew why he hadn't. He wanted me angry. And it worked. I plugged the USB drive back into my computer and opened the final video file. The footage was grainy, shot from a hidden camera, likely a buttonhole or a pen. It showed a conference room inside Heliodyne. Dr. Adrian Cole was standing at the head of the table, looking younger but just as cold. "The subjects are showing 30% cognitive decline," Adrian said on the screen, tapping a chart. "But their aggression levels are up by 200%. This is within the acceptable range of collateral damage for the Lazarus objectives." Collateral damage. That is what he called human beings. That is what he called my son. I spent the next 3 days turning my living room into a command center. I printed every document, every scan, and taped them to the floral wallpaper. I drew lines connecting Adrian Cole to Sheriff Clay Mathers, and Clay to the sudden disappearance of the accident photos. For the first time in my life, I bought a set of neon highlighters and used them like weapons. I also had to teach myself how to become a spy. It would have been comical if it were not so deadly. Here I was, a 72-year-old woman who usually struggled to program the microwave, watching online tutorials on how to set up encrypted email accounts and secure messaging apps. I felt ridiculous. Typing on a keyboard with arthritic fingers, learning about VPNs instead of knitting patterns. But necessity is a brutal teacher. Once I felt ready, I made my first move. I booked a ticket on a public tour of the Heliodyne headquarters in Harbour Point. I registered under my real name, but I signed up with a local senior citizens group called Silver Horizons. I knew they would overlook a busload of elderly retirees. We were invisible to people like Adrian Cole. The headquarters was a fortress of glass and steel. As our group shuffled through the lobby, guided by a perky intern, I kept my head down. I wore a heavy coat, but pinned prominently to my collar was a large button with Michael's face on it, the kind usually worn at memorial walks. Beneath his smiling face were the words, Michael Briggs, gone but not forgotten. We were in the main atrium when he appeared. Adrian Cole was walking with an entourage of suits, looking every bit the master of the universe. He paused to greet our tour group, playing the role of the benevolent CEO. "Welcome to Heliodyne," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "We are proud of the work we do here to keep our country safe." I stepped forward, just slightly, ensuring I was in his line of sight. He looked at the group, smiling vacantly, until his eyes landed on my chest. He saw the button. He saw the name Briggs. For a fraction of a second, his mask slipped. The corner of his mouth twitched, a tiny, involuntary spasm of recognition and annoyance. He remembered. He knew exactly who Michael was, and he knew exactly who I must be. "Wonderful to have you all," he finished quickly, turning away. But his pace had quickened. He was rattled. I had my hand in my pocket the entire time, clutching the burner phone which was recording every word. I caught his little speech about safety, and more importantly, I caught a comment he muttered to his assistant as he walked away, loud enough for my device to pick up. "Check the guest list. Why is she here?" I returned home with my heart hammering against my ribs. I sat at my computer and opened the encrypted email service I had just learned to use. I attached the audio recording of Adrian, the video of the meeting, and the scan of the Lazarus report. I typed in the address of Naomi Brooks, the investigative podcaster Zoe had told me about. I wrote only one line in the body of the email. "If I die because of a strange accident in the next few days, please know that I have touched Lazarus. And this is why." I hit send. The war had officially begun. Naomi Brooks looked nothing like the voice I had heard on her podcasts. She walked into the Railway Brew coffee shop wearing a leather jacket and combat boots, her hair a sharp, unnatural shade of silver. She spotted me in the corner booth and hesitated. I could see the calculation in her eyes, the worry that she had flown halfway across the country to entertain the fantasies of a lonely, senile woman. "Mrs. Briggs," she asked, sliding into the seat opposite me. "I am Naomi. Look, I have to be honest. I get 100 emails a week about corporate cover-ups. Most of them are, well, they are not real." I did not argue. I simply placed the burner phone on the table and pressed play. As Michael's voice filled the small space between us, the barista's grinder whirred in the background. But Naomi froze. She listened to the entire recording, her eyes widening as she watched the video of Adrian Cole discussing acceptable brain damage. When the tape ended, she looked pale. "I have been chasing Heliodyne for 3 years," Naomi whispered, leaning in close. "There have been rumors, whispers about off-book testing sites and missing veterans, but we never had a smoking gun. This is not just a gun. This is the whole arsenal. We spent the entire afternoon in that booth. The coffee went cold as we strategized. It was a strange alliance. Naomi spoke of media cycles, encryption, and legal precedents. I spoke of the town, the geography of the cemetery, and the habits of the men who had killed my son. We decided to do things the right way first. Naomi used her contacts to set up an emergency meeting with an assistant United States attorney in the nearest city, a man she claimed was a bulldog for justice. 2 days later, we drove into the city, armed with copies of the evidence. But when we arrived at the federal building, the receptionist looked at us with confusion. "Mr. Henderson is not in," she said. "You did not hear. He suffered a massive stroke at his gym 2 days ago. He is in critical condition." My blood ran cold. 2 days ago, that was the day we made the appointment. "And his files?" Naomi asked sharply. "I cannot discuss that," the receptionist said, her eyes darting away. We walked out of the building into the grey sunlight. The message was clear. They were watching us. They were ahead of us. By the time we got back to Riverside Hollow, the digital counterattack had begun. Naomi's phone started buzzing incessantly. "I am locked out of my email," she said, tapping furiously at her screen. "And look at this." She showed me a forum page. An anonymous article had just gone viral. The headline read, "The Senile Mother and the Fame-Hungry Podcaster, How Grief Becomes Exploitation." The text painted me as a delusional woman suffering from dementia, and Naomi as a vulture preying on the elderly for clicks. "They are trying to discredit us before we even release the story," I said, feeling a mix of shame and anger. "It is a standard playbook," Naomi said, though her voice was tight. "They want you to feel isolated, but the real violation was waiting for me at home. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw my front door was slightly ajar. I rushed inside, ignoring Naomi's warning to wait. My house had been turned upside down. Drawers were pulled out, clothes were slashed, and the furniture was overturned. The spot where I had hidden the USB drive was empty. But the most chilling part was the message scrawled in thick black permanent marker across my living room wallpaper. "Stop, Mrs. Briggs." Naomi stood in the doorway, looking at the destruction. "They took the drive. Eleanor, we lost the evidence." I walked over to a potted fern in the corner, one of the few things they had not smashed. I dug my fingers into the soil and pulled out a small, plastic-wrapped memory card. Then I walked to the hallway and peeled back the backing of a photo frame, revealing another card. "I am 72, Naomi." "Not stupid," I said, brushing dirt off the plastic. "I learned a long time ago that you never keep your eggs in one basket, especially when there are wolves in the henhouse." Naomi stared at me, and then a slow, fierce grin spread across her face. That night, there was a knock at the back door. We froze. I grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, but when I peered through the curtains, I saw Lieutenant Zoe Martinez. She was not in uniform. She looked small and frightened. I opened the door, and Zoe stepped in, looking at the vandalized walls with horror. "I cannot do this anymore," Zoe said, her voice shaking. "I looked into Clay's finances like you asked. He has been receiving monthly consulting fees from a shell company linked to Heliodyne since the day he retired. And when I asked the chief about the old case files again, I was transferred to traffic duty effective tomorrow morning. They own the police, Zoe," I said gently. "They own the courts." Zoe looked at me, tears in her eyes. "So what do we do if we cannot go to the law? Who do we go to?" I looked at Naomi. then at the scattered remnants of my life on the floor. "We do not go to anyone," I said. "If the system is built to protect them, then we have to build our own stage. We are going to make them confess, and we are going to make sure the whole world is watching when they do." The opportunity arrived wrapped in a blizzard and buried inside an encrypted memo that Naomi intercepted. Heliodyne was panicking. The leaks, the rumors, and the sudden pressure were forcing them to circle the wagons. Naomi found a reservation confirmation for a crisis management retreat at Grey Pines Lodge, an isolated luxury resort high in the Maple Crest Mountains. It was scheduled for this weekend, a desperate attempt to plug the holes in their sinking ship. "This is it," Naomi said, pacing my living room, which was now covered in maps and schematics. "All the key players will be there. Adrian Cole, the board members, and their new head of security, Clay Mathers. They are going up there to bury the story for good." I looked at the map, tracing the winding road up the mountain with my finger. "We are not going to let them bury it," I said, my voice steady and cold. "We are not just going there to listen, Naomi. We are going to force them to confess before the whole world. They used my son as a lab rat. I will use the lot of them as a lesson for America." We needed a way in, and the weather gave us one. Zoe called us with a tip that the catering company originally hired for the retreat had cancelled at the last minute due to the severe snow forecast. It was the opening we needed. Within 3 hours, Naomi had created a shell entity called Golden Fork Events, complete with a fake website and stellar reviews. She bid on the contract for half the price, promising that snow is no obstacle for quality service. They accepted immediately. We hired a few locals to carry boxes, but the core team was just us. I spent 40 years cooking for church potlucks and community fundraisers. I knew how to feed a crowd, and more importantly, I knew how to be invisible. I put on a white apron and a hairnet, transforming from a vengeful mother into a harmless, sweet-faced kitchen matron. Nobody looks twice at an old woman peeling potatoes. Naomi brought in a friend of hers, a young man named Malik, who moved with nervous energy but had steady hands. He was our audio technician, brought in to set up a new sound system for the conference room. In reality, he was wiring the entire lodge for a global broadcast. Every microphone, every speaker, and 3 hidden cameras were linked to a server that would push the feed live to Naomi's massive podcast audience the moment we gave the signal. We arrived at the lodge a day early to prep. The air up there was thin and biting. While unloading crates of vegetables near the service entrance, I saw 2 figures smoking on the balcony above me. I stopped, pressing myself against the rough stone wall. It was Adrian Cole and Clay Mathers. "We need to be done with this," Adrian said, his voice carrying in the crisp air. "The investors are getting skittish. Is the leak contained?" "I handled Jonah," Clay replied, and hearing his voice made my hand grip the crate so hard a splinter drove into my palm. "And the paperwork is gone. The only loose end is that old hag from Riverside, Eleanor. She is making noise, but who listens to a senile widow? Just make sure she stays quiet," Adrian muttered. "Permanently, if you have to. We cannot have a ghost story ruining a billion-dollar merger." That old hag from Riverside. Something inside me snapped, but it was not a break. It was a setting of bone. The grief that had weighed me down for 20 years evaporated, replaced by a clarity that was sharp as a butcher's knife. I was no longer the mother crying over a closed casket. I was the hunter they did not know was already in the room. We finalized the plan in the walk-in freezer to avoid bugs. When the meeting started tomorrow, Malik would activate the live stream. Naomi would blast the scanned documents to every major news outlet in the country simultaneously, and I would walk into that room, not as a caterer, but as the ghost they feared. The night before the event, I stood alone behind the kitchen, looking out at the dark tree line of the pine forest. The wind howled, kicking up swirls of snow. "Son," I whispered to the freezing wind, "if I fail tomorrow, at least they will know your mother tried. But if I succeed, then you can finally rest." I turned back to the lodge, wiping the snow from my face. I was ready to burn it all down. The Grey Pines Lodge was locked down tighter than a bank vault. Private security guards in dark suits patrolled every hallway, sweeping the furniture with electronic wands to check for bugs. But they missed the high-fidelity microphone embedded in the fire suppression sensor above the conference table because Malik had installed it inside the casing 24 hours ago. I watched from the crack in the pantry door as Adrian Cole, Clay Mathers, and 7 other high-ranking board members filed into the room, one by one. They dropped their smartphones into a lead-lined lockbox by the door. It was standard protocol to prevent corporate espionage, but today they were voluntarily cutting off their only lifeline to the outside world. "We are live." Naomi's voice crackled in my tiny earpiece, hidden beneath my hairnet. 5,000 listeners and climbing. "Malik, hold the signal steady." Inside the room, the heavy oak doors clicked shut. I adjusted the volume on my receiver to hear them clearly. "Let's make this quick." Adrian's voice boomed through the hidden speakers. "The stock is taking a hit. We need a narrative to counter the leaks." "We stick to the rogue employee story," Clay suggested, his voice smooth and dismissive as he leaned back in his leather chair. "We blame the data irregularities on the dead technicians from the early 2000s. Specifically Michael Briggs. He had a history of insubordination. We paint him as unstable, a kid who falsified records before he killed himself in a reckless accident. He is dead. He cannot sue for defamation." My hands, covered in flour from the morning biscuits, curled into fists so tight my nails dug into my palms. They were going to kill his reputation just like they killed his body. "Sound is clear," Naomi whispered in my ear. "They are digging their own graves. Are you ready?" "Eleanor." I wiped my hands on my apron. I was born ready. I picked up the heavy silver tray laden with coffee and pastries. I took a deep breath, pushed open the service door, and stepped into the lion's den. The conversation died instantly. 9 pairs of eyes turned to me. For a moment, there was only confusion. Then, recognition dawned on Clay's face, turning his smug expression into a mask of pure shock. "Coffee, gentlemen?" I asked, my voice ringing clear in the silence. Adrian Cole stood up slowly, forcing a polite, plastic smile, though his eyes darted to the door. "Mrs. Briggs. What on earth? Did you get lost on the way to the kitchen security?" "I am not lost." "Adrian," I said, setting the tray down on the mahogany table with a loud clatter that made them jump. "I am exactly where I need to be." I looked directly at the ceiling sensor where the microphone was hidden, then back at the men who had destroyed my life. "You just proposed blaming my son for your crimes," I said, stepping closer to Adrian. "But Michael did not falsify records. He found them. That is why you blew up his car on the Old Mill Bridge. That is why you kept his phone line active for 20 years under Project Lazarus. You are delusional," Clay spat, standing up and reaching inside his jacket. "Get out." "If I am delusional," I countered, my voice rising. Then why did you have to push Jonah Price down a flight of stairs 3 days ago? Was he delusional too? Or did he just have the backup files you thought you burned? Adrian slammed his hand on the table, his face flushing red. You have no idea what you are talking about. The Lazarus protocols were necessary. We made tough decisions to advance cognitive warfare. The world runs on the sacrifices of people like your son, people who don't matter in the grand scheme. You think I care about one dead engineer when we are building the future? Got him. Naomi's voice cheered in my ear. He just confessed. The whole country heard that. But the celebration was premature. Clay was not looking at me anymore. He was looking up. He had seen the tiny red glint of the power light reflecting off the chrome light fixture. We are being recorded. Clay snarled. In one fluid motion, he drew a sleek black pistol from his shoulder holster. The other executives scrambled back in terror, overturning chairs. Clay leveled the weapon at my chest. Clay! Don't, Adrian shouted, realizing too late that the situation had spiraled out of control. Clay looked wild, cornered, and dangerous. He looked up at the ceiling, shouting at the invisible audience. Are you listening, Ms. Brooks? He roared. You think you are clever. You think this is a game. You just killed her. Eleanor, run! Naomi screamed in my ear. I didn't move. I stared down the barrel of the gun, holding Clay's gaze with all the hatred I had stored for 20 years. Shoot me. I challenged him softly. It won't bring the secret back. The fire alarm blared suddenly, Malik's desperate attempt to create chaos. Bang. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. I felt a rush of wind, and the world tilted sideways. The last thing I saw was the live stream monitor on the wall flickering, the image distorting into static before cutting to absolute black. The bullet missed my heart by inches, but the heat of it slapped my cheek like a physical hand. Behind me, the large glass carafe of coffee shattered, exploding into a shower of scalding liquid and razor-sharp shards. I threw myself to the carpet, gasping as the hot coffee soaked into the back of my blouse. For a second, the only sound was the ringing in my ears and the thud of my own heart against the floorboards. Cut the power, Clay screamed, his voice cracking with panic as he scrambled toward the wall panel. Kill the feed. Now. But the feed did not die. Through the tiny earpiece still dislodged but buzzing near my ear, I heard Naomi's voice, fierce and trembling, broadcasting to the nation. They are shooting, Naomi announced, her voice thick with emotion. You are listening to the executive board of Heliodyne Dynamics attempting to murder a 72-year-old woman because she dared to speak the truth about her son. Malik had done his job. The backup batteries kicked in, and the red light on the ceiling sensor blinked steadily, an unblinking eye of judgment, trapped like a rat. Adrian Cole dropped to his knees beside Clay, his face pale and sweating. He leaned in, his voice a hiss of pure venom, unaware that the high-frequency microphone on his own lapel was still hot. Kill her, Adrian whispered, the sound amplified clearly through the system. Do it now. We will plant a gun on her. We will say she was an active shooter. We have done worse things than this. I lay pressed against the floor, the smell of burnt coffee and gunpowder filling my nose. I was bleeding from a cut on my cheek, but my mind was crystal clear. I remembered Michael's voice on the tape. If they touch you, Mom, burn them. This was the point of no return. I saw the exposed wiring of the internal PA system running along the baseboard near my head. With a surge of adrenaline that defied my age, I reached out and ripped the cables free, stripping the insulation and twisting them together to bypass the mute function. Suddenly, Naomi's voice was no longer just in my ear. It boomed through the conference room speakers, loud and godlike. Dr. Adrian Cole, Clay Mathers. Naomi's voice thundered, echoing off the mahogany walls. America is listening to you. The police are listening to you. From outside the lodge, the wail of sirens cut through the winter wind. It was not the local sheriff. It was the heavy, rhythmic warble of federal vehicles. Zoe had sent the only people Clay could not buy. No, Clay roared. He lunged at me, his eyes wide with the madness of a man whose world is collapsing. He grabbed a handful of my hair and hauled me up, wrenching my arm behind my back. He used me as a shield, facing the door. The gun in his other hand wavered. In the struggle, I stomped down hard on his instep with my heel. He howled, his grip loosening just enough for me to twist away. The gun slipped from his sweaty palm and skittered across the polished floor, spinning until it stopped at the feet of Adrian Cole. The room froze. Adrian looked at the gun, then at the door, where the heavy footsteps of a tactical team were thundering closer. He looked at Clay, and I saw the calculation happen in real time. He picked up the weapon, but he did not aim it at me. He aimed it at his partner. It was his idea, Adrian screamed, his voice high and shrill, desperate to offer a sacrifice to the gods of justice. He cut the brake lines. He rigged the car. I just signed the papers. It was Mathers. He was confessing to the mechanics of my son's murder to save his own skin. And the live stream caught every pathetic syllable. The double doors splintered inward with a crash. Federal agents, drop it. Clay made a move, perhaps to run, perhaps to attack. But a single shot rang out from the doorway. Clay crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder. Adrian dropped the gun as if it were molten lead and fell to his knees, raising his blood-spattered hands in surrender. I sank back down to the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I watched as the agents swarmed the room, shouting commands, cuffing the men in expensive suits. The noise was overwhelming, but in the center of it, I felt a strange, hollow silence. I looked at the ceiling sensor one last time. We did it. Michael, I pulled you out of the fire. The federal courthouse in the city was a cavern of marble and judgment, packed so tight with reporters and veterans that the air felt thin. In the defendant's dock, Dr. Adrian Cole sat slumped in his chair, his once impeccable silver hair matted and wild. Beside him sat Clay Mathers, his arm in a sling from the bullet wound he took during the raid, looking less like a sheriff and more like a trapped animal. They refused to look at the gallery behind them, where 3 rows of men in wheelchairs and crutches, the survivors of Project Lazarus, sat in silent accusation. The prosecutor did not need theatrics. He simply dimmed the lights and played the footage from the Grey Pines Lodge on the massive screens. The jury watched Adrian confess to accepting brain damage as a statistic. They watched Clay admit to cutting the brake lines of a 22-year-old engineer's car. My voice, mixed with Naomi's narration from the live stream, filled the courtroom, becoming the undeniable historic record of their cruelty. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium. My arm still ached from the struggle in the conference room, but my hand was steady as I unfolded a yellowed piece of paper. It was the memorandum Michael had written the night before he died. My son wrote this, knowing he might not live to see the morning. I told the judge, my voice amplifying through the microphone. He wrote, I want the world to be better, even if I have to pay for it with my career. He paid with his life. I turned to look directly at Adrian. He flinched. I do not want your apology. Dr. Cole, I said coldly, and I do not want you to just sit in a cell. I am requesting that the court seize all personal assets from these defendants, every stock, every house, every offshore account, and use them to establish the Michael Briggs Fund. This fund will provide legal defense for whistleblowers and medical treatment for the veterans you broke. I want it so that every dollar you made from the pain of others must return to heal those very wounds. Adrian tried to stand, stammering his final defense. I was following orders. The country. It needs sacrifices. But the jury looked at the veterans in the gallery, and then back at the man who called them collateral damage. The deliberation took less than 2 hours. The gavel came down like a hammer blow life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole for both Adrian Cole and Clay Mathers. Outside on the courthouse steps, Naomi Brooks stood before a wall of cameras. Today marks the end of an era, Naomi declared to the microphones. This is the day a 72-year-old grandmother defeated a billion-dollar defense contractor. She used the only weapon they could not account for the memory of a mother and a phone call that seemed to come from the grave. 3 months later, the autumn leaves were turning gold at Greenhaven Rest Cemetery. I walked the familiar path to the family plot, the gravel crunching softly under my boots. This time, I did not bring tears. I brought a laminated copy of the court's decision and a small brochure for the newly opened Michael Briggs Fund. I propped them up against the cold granite of his headstone. You won, son, I said, the wind catching my words. It just took 20 years. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my new smartphone. I opened the contacts list and scrolled down to the entry I had saved as Michael, home, with the old landline number that had started this entire storm. I stared at it for a long time. I no longer needed a ghost to call me to know he was there. His voice was now permanent. It was in the court records. It was in the foundation that bore his name. It was in the lives of the men getting treatment. I tapped the edit button. I renamed the contact The Truth. Then, with a thumb that no longer trembled, I pressed delete. Goodbye. Michael. I whispered. I stood up and smoothed my coat, in the distance, just visible over the cemetery wall. I could see the small sign of the office space I had rented for the foundation. I was their honorary advisor. I had work to do. As the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the grass, I turned my back on the grave and began to walk. I did not look back. For the first time in 2 decades, I was not leaving my son behind in the cold earth. I was carrying his victory forward, using the sharp edges of my grief to carve a safer world for everyone else. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can share this moment together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this story reach even more people.